I'm happy to kick off our panel for today, which is the panel on the future of assessment. And it'll be moderated by Candice Till from Amazon. And I'll let Candice introduce our esteemed panelists for today.
Okay, thanks, Renee. So today we're talking about the future of assessment. And with us today, we've invited three experts with a diversity of expertise and experience in the field of assessment. First, we have Temple Lovelace. And I'm going to let each of the panelists, after I do the just brief introduction, say a little bit more about their work. So I'll just give you their names right now. Temple Lovelace, Craig Zillis. I knew I was going to blow that. And Michael Nettles. So why don't we just start off? The way the panel is going to work is each panelist will have about 5 minutes to kind of introduce themselves and do their opening remark about assessment. And then I'll ask some questions of the panelists. And then but the real part is to open it up to all of you to ask all of your questions about the future of assessment. So Temple, would you like to start?
Absolutely. So, hey, everybody. I'm Temple Lovelace. I am here from Chapel Hill, North Carolina. And I am most recently affiliated with a new fund called the Advanced Education Research and Development Fund. And what we do is we are a nonprofit home base for inclusive R&D programs that are focused on intractable challenges within the education space. So before digging a little bit into kind of the meat of what we're going to talk about today, I'm going to tell you a little story. And I'm a former educator, and I'm a former educator of the little ones. So we're going to start with story time. So as an educator, when I was in the learning space, I would make decisions about what to teach. I would make decisions about what to assess. And those were two different pathways for me to think through. And so when I got, mastery of my pedagogy, I had a bank of things I did when it came to teaching and a bank of things I did when it came to assessment. And so at one point I became good enough to be able to mix and merge those things as I needed to. Then I became a teacher educator, and then I began to teach future teachers. And I would work with them on teach, methods courses and then teach my assessment courses, doing the same silly thing, keeping those things separate. Now that I've gotten to the R&D space, what I've realized is that we do similar things. We do a lot of amazing investigations in how to teach, right? What to teach, and a lot of things in assessment. And we don't do a lot of that iteration together. And so for me, when I think about one of the big solutions, the things I'm looking at is how do we merge the two? How do we look at assessment for learning? If you've heard those words, you probably have done some of the work, seen some of the work around Dr. Edmund Gordon's work around assessment for learning, right? How do we assess for learning instead of assessment of learning? And so our work really is focused on the contextualization and operationalizing that as a proof point for what does assessment for learning look like? How can learners bring what they know to the assessment space and us use that to make database decisions on what should come next? And so a lot of the work we do in the R&D space is focused on that. How do we create better tools, better frameworks for assessment for learning? So I'll stop there and pass it off to my colleague, and then a little bit more about him.
Great.
Sure.
Craig.
Hi, I'm Craig Zillis. I'm currently at the University of Illinois, and I am a huge fan of assessment. I think when I think about courses, I think assessment is where a lot of the learning happens, both because it's incentivizing the learning as well as sort of shaping the learning. I made a few notes to keep myself in time. So when I think about the future of assessment, it's heavily influenced by the work we've been doing in Illinois. I'm going to talk a little about that, but mostly talk about some of the sort of, I think, big lessons we've learned from doing that, which I think guide us towards my view, I guess, at least, of what the future of assessment. So Illinois is a large university. We have a bunch of very large classes. And so one of the things that we've done is in the past 10 years, we've put together what we call the computer-based testing facility. So this is a collection of proctored computer labs where students are given a multi-day window. They can pick when they take an exam. They have to make a reservation, but then they show up at that time, they sit down, they take a computer-based exam that is interactively graded, and so they know their score on the exam by the time they leave the exam. So again, we've been doing this for about 10 years. We have about 50 classes on our campus doing this. We run around 70,000 exams per semester doing this. So what has this told me about the future of assessment? Number one, automation is important. So in this context, we're automating both some of the grading and almost all the logistics of dealing with things. So for example, conflict exams and whatnot. We don't want to distract our humans thinking about those things. That the key idea is really, we want to automate the things that get better with automation to free up the humans to do the things that humans do better than computers. So in the context of assessment, for us, this means we're automating the assessment of a lot of the lower level building block skills to free up the humans to do things like helping assess open-ended projects, more creative work, the higher level skills. So our number two observation is that we want to reduce the instructor effort of assessment so it can be deployed optimally pedagogically, or more optimally pedagogically. So we've studied this in two dimensions. One is more frequent assessment. So rather than running a couple of exams during the semester, we encourage running smaller exams every 2 to 3 weeks. We've seen this improves learning. It also increases interaction in the class. And in particular, if your first serious assessment is early in the semester, if the student is struggling, they aren't so far behind that they can't catch up. But, if your first assessment isn't the week 8, maybe it's too late for them to sort of catch back up. The second thing that reducing the cost of assessment does is it facilitates giving multiple chances. So traditionally, most classes run exams exactly once. If the student doesn't learn the material, the class has moved on. There's no incentive for them to go back and learn the material. So if you reduce the cost of assessment, you can run every exam multiple times. And the students, what we've seen is they will go and remediate the things that they don't know, come back and demonstrate that mastery if you give them an incentive to do that. So we see them do that. We find they learn more as assessed by final exams. They feel assessment is more fair when they're given multiple attempts. And we've seen a 30% drop in reported test anxiety when they know that if they don't do well on this instance, they have another chance. My third thing is rapid feedback. So immediate feedback, I don't have to convince this audience that that's important. Number 4 is rich assessment. So a broad range of assessments can be implemented on a computer and automatically scored. It doesn't just have to be multiple choice. So we've had people auto-grade things like drawing free body diagrams, assembling proofs, designing finite state machines, designing circuits, manipulating 3D objects in 3 dimensions in a robotics course. And then the last thing is sharing. That building these rich assessments is time consuming, but there's no reason that each faculty member has to do this themselves. That we need better networks for sharing these things, and we need better networks for tracking the credit of these. So if I develop one of these things, I can get statistics back on who's using it that I can use to report in my promotion case, for example. In the same way that we look at citations for publications, we should have some way of rewarding people that develop assessments, in their career.
Great, thanks, Craig. Michael?
Good afternoon, and I'm Michael Nettles, as Candace said, and I'm a senior vice president at ETS in Princeton, New Jersey, and I'm the Edmund W. Gordon Chair of Policy Evaluation and Research at ETS. For the past several years at ETS, but throughout my career, I've been observing group differences in conventional standardized tests. ETS, like other testing companies, is a pretty much a large-scale standardized testing operation that very often has high stakes associated with it, whether it's admission to colleges and universities or decisions about which path people are directed. And for as long as I have observed the outcomes of standardized tests, there have been differential or different performance levels across demographic population groups, race and social class, And these differences are pretty wide and unchanged over time. So what we've been thinking lately through a series of symposiums, seminars, one called Structural Stigma, taxing the African American students. And the second one, most recent, is a different kind of thinking about assessment. Has led us to think about AI as a vehicle for addressing many of the inequities and inequalities in student opportunities and performance. We have been working with one company called Area 9 Lyceum, for example, which has an AI system for learning, to try to begin to collaborate on integrating assessment into the learning process, much of the way I think Craig has described it here just a few moments ago. So we are thinking that perhaps in response to a different kind of thinking, where what we concluded was that people need assessments in smaller doses, shorter spans of time, as to offer a prospect for both learning and having the opportunity to demonstrate better their performance. Now, what we're challenged by, even with the AI, are several things. One is also the need for greater participation in the assessment, development, and construction process. And I think that would carry over to learning as well. So we need to hear from a broader range and a broader spectrum of the population about what the content should be and how it should be administered and the language used to present it. We also need to broaden the participation in thinking about the data, because what we're realizing is that through the technology, we're going to be generating a vast amount of data and information. And the question is it the type of data and information that we need to improve instruction and to inform performance on assessments? The data analyses will become much more important, and the question there is, how can we conduct analysis that would help us to go beyond the demographic classifications that we use now, because they represent important social constructs. And we think we need to continue to do that, but we may also, through the technology and through AI, be able to broaden our scope of how we see learners and the teaching and learning process into different kind of clusters that would be much more aligned with learning and assessment than, say, the demographic dimensions that we presently use. So we're excited about the prospects that AI offers for also providing greater access to high quality content. Many people who in the country do not have access to high quality instruction, very often lacking access to instructors or teachers, faculty who are trained in the content area as well. And so we think this offers the opportunity to engage and include people in higher quality content and process. So with that, I'll leave that as my opening remarks and look forward to the conversation.
Great. So I was going to ask a couple questions, and then hopefully you all will have questions. So I wanted each of you to sort of speak for a moment. We talk about assessment, which can mean many different things. So just a quick little definition of how you operationalize the term assessment for the purposes of your work. And since this panel is about the future of assessment, I'd like to hear each of your perspectives from your work about what the limitations are of our current models of assessment. Why do we need to be thinking about what the future holds?
Yeah, one of the classic definitions of assessment is to sit beside. You have the image of an instructor or a coach sitting next to a pupil or learner and interacting, and almost in conversational approaches to ensure that the learner learns. So in a sense, when we think about the future now, we have the opportunity to go back to the future. What's happened in the time between the future and the past is that we've had large numbers of people needing to be processed at the same time and on conditions that are standardized. And I think that while those are important elements of assessment, that is, for people to feel like they are, when there are large numbers of people, pursuing the same objective, whether it's achieving the standards or pursuing admissions to undergraduate school or to graduate or professional school, that there's some kind of fairness in the process that gives people equal opportunity. Now, what the problem is that fairness is doesn't really work that way. It can work under the conditions of the assessment, but we also must take into account the conditions that people had at their disposal leading up to the assessment process. So the future is trying to work out that imbalance between the conditions of an event, a single event over a 3 or 4 hour period, to the conditions that people have to live through every day in the process of teaching, learning, and living.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, how do I follow up that? My definition is pretty simple. It's about information gathering. Where I probably would lean in more to that is that I think it should be a two-way street. A lot of times the things that we do with assessment is unidirectional. I'm going to do something to get information from this person, and then I do something with that information that a lot of times may not be with the person I was assessing. And so at Assessment for Good, we focus on the late elementary, early middle school space, so learners 8 to 13. And we focus on formative assessment because we know that teachers are making thousands of decisions every single day. And so can we create better tools that allow them to make better decisions? And can we create tools that allow the learner to learn more about where they are, right, in space as it relates to what they're supposed to be learning? Or for us, we dig into social development, emotional development. So for me, it's really, yes, it's about information gathering, but the future of that is, can we change the directionality of that? Can we look at having it be something that the learner can do and learn more about what they're doing so they can even make better decisions for what comes next for them?
Yeah, just a couple thoughts, not clearly formed, but this distinction between sort of formative and summative. I think in the future we're likely to see more blending of those. I think many of us as educators, wish we didn't have to do summative assessment, but it seems to be sort of necessary. I'm a huge follower of behavioral economics, and things like incentive structures and deadlines, have roles in helping people shape their own behavior to learn the things that they've set out to learn for themselves. I think one of the other things that so I think we in some ways want to blend those things, so that we can be collecting data about how well a student has succeeded. But I think, in my mind, one of the challenges there is you want to, I think, in a formative space, allow a lot of collaboration, learning collaboratively. But at the end of the day, one of the things that you want to assess is that student's individual skills. And so that prevents sort of a complete coupling of those two things. The second thing to think about, I think, is sort of following up on Temple's comments about sort of metacognition. I think we want to help the students learn to assess the degree which they've mastered the material themselves. But I think that's a skill that, as the students get better, they're more capable of. So perhaps early on, either, for younger students in particular, we need to provide more support of helping the student, telling the student sort of, here's the things that you need to study, because we've assessed what you're lacking in. But as the student grows, both, maturity as well as maturity within a particular discipline, we want to put more of that onto the student to help them learn to recognize what it is that they're lacking in, so that, because once they go out into the real world, there aren't going to be systems telling, oh, you don't know this. They're going to have to assess themselves. And that, how do we scaffold that metacognition?
Yeah, I mean, so this room is full of people that are doing research in human learning, but also people who are doing a lot of development, platform development, tool development, process development. So I guess if they're thinking about, I'm building a learning system, and a core part of that learning system has assessment capabilities to it, is there any sort of guidance or advice or perspective or request to people in that situation that each of you would give as you're thinking about the platforms and tools you're building with respect to the assessment components?
Yeah, I'll start here and then pass it off to my esteemed colleagues. For me, a lot of the work we do is based upon inclusive R&D, right? So if you're thinking about the solution, if you have already decided, what the right answer is, but we haven't connected to the communities that are going to be using the solution, if we don't have a good understanding of the ways in which they might see it being successful or the decisions that you're making around assessment, then we're probably working a bit harder than we need to, versus making sure that that relationship and partnership is there. And so at Assessment for Good, we start with researchers and developers and educators, and even in some cases learners at the table. So though they are co-designing the solution, right? So for us, if it's measure development and we're looking at the blend of executive functioning and social development, and they're creating a measure for that, there are educators at the table along with developers to understand the ways in which that system may or may not function, the way in which those questions may or may not be endorsed by those you need them to be, right? So how do we create better items? How do we create better situations with the people there at the same time that we're making those design decisions, is how we try to tackle it.
Michael or Craig, do you want to?
Yeah, I don't know so we end up building a lot of our own tools because we don't see them out in the world. But yeah, I think I would love to hear people's questions or specific questions. It's hard for me to I think definitely giving people the flexibility. I think as we move to using computers to assess, one of our key things, we didn't want to dumb down the kinds of things that we asked, and so we built a lot of flexibility into our tools so we could continue and actually ask more sophisticated things on a computer than we were doing on paper. So I think that's a key thing, that if you're designing tools, flexibility in that dimension. I think student flexibility is important, that, let them, practice whenever they want, as much as they want. And then, flexibility as far as, like, for us, students can take the exams at a time that's convenient for them, so those are some of the I think mantras that sort of we keep in mind in our development. But
yeah, well, just 2 points. So one is that I think of legal accommodations as a point of departure from which we can learn. The government has intervened to ensure that there are opportunities for people to demonstrate what they know when there are disabilities involved, health related disabilities or physical disabilities. And what I think is that people, we know, and I think the technology, the AI technology permits us to know more about some of the impediments that people are experiencing when they are involved in an assessment, and gives us the opportunity to make even preventive or voluntary rather than required or demanded changes or adjustments in how we administer assessments. So to some degree, if you're thinking about optimizing the opportunity for people to demonstrate what they know and can do, and what they need to know and can do, then I think the technology presents us with amazing opportunities, and we're just on the verge of exploration. The second issue that I would like to suggest is that even with the technology advancing at the rate that it is, and we have access to it, we have to be trained to not think of assessment through the conventional lenses, requiring the same standards and the same conventions that we've used in the past. And that's going to take a while. Just as an example, we have, rules about and ways of knowing how many items it takes to capture a domain of knowledge. And sometimes that can be, 40 or 50 items. It could be a pool of items from which things are randomly selected, but still a large number. And in the AI context, our colleagues are telling us that they can know with some level of certainty, with far fewer items, before branching people into areas of either more comfort or more challenge through the adaptive nature of the assessment. And so we're now confronting ways to try to reconcile those two camps. So the science has to develop around what's possible and new ways of thinking about assessment that bridges the divide between the conventional and the contemporary.
Yeah, that's that tension between the computer scientists and the psychometricians.
Yes.
So why don't we open it to the room? What questions do people have about assessment, the future of assessment?
Questions or comments?
Questions or comments, or if you have expertise you want to share. Ken.
Thanks. Great topic, and appreciate the panel and the panelists to comment on it. I know of a couple of investigations that looked at formative assessment data to predict summative assessment results, and with quite high reliability. And in one of these studies, the model was built on 1 year's data, predicting that year's outcomes, but then it was applied to the next year's data, and it was like 84, 85, 0.85 correlation level, like probably matching retest reliability on the summative. But I know of 2 such studies. It feels like we need more of those, but it also raises this super interesting question about like, what is the gold standard? Like, which would you trust more? An hour's worth of performance on 50 items, or a year's worth of performance, right? On, I don't know, 500 or 1,000. And I guess it's a call for, if you know about other studies like that, I'd love to hear about it, but I'd love to see one where the standardized test was used to predict the performance in class in the next year, right? Versus class performance in one predicting the other, right? And maybe we could find out in some sense which one of those is more the gold standard, if you see what I mean. I wonder if anybody knows about those kinds of other studies like that, or what you think about, maybe we should put a call out to our communities to do more of those.
Is formative assessment a better predictor than some of them?
Yeah, actually, thank you, Candace, for saying that, because I was kind of thinking of that as maybe we don't need summative if formative can be summative, right?
Yeah.
And I don't think it goes the other way.
Right. Yeah. So a lot of the learning happens during the formative assessment. I think that's pretty clear. I think my only concern there is there's this thing called cheating, and so one of the keys that if you make the formative assessment summative, then the students may have a larger incentive to cheat in that context, which breaks that relationship, I guess.
And maybe it's easier too, because they have the same incentive to cheat on the summative, right?
Right,
It's not
but
that the incentives change.
Right.
But I wanted to make sure, one thing that's really important about the models in these is the models of the formative assessments have a growth component.
Yep.
Right?
Yep.
It's not your average score over, it's the projected performance on the trajectory you're on, right? Because another potential problem is you're measuring a moving vehicle, right? And these assessments are supposed to give, a state of time. But since they're growth models, they can give that. Yeah, but yeah, I don't know if cheating's differential, maybe because there are higher security on the summative tests. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, that I think
Yeah.
that typically we do a lot more formative assessment than summative assessment, and that allows us to focus for the summative assessment, whatever security precautions, to make that more trustworthy.
Yeah.
So that other than if in a world where there is no cheating, I don't think there's any need for summative assessment that's decoupled from formative assessment. But
It does
sadly,
seem a little tricky, because if the probability of cheating is 10 times more in one work versus the other, but you have 10 times more assessments, maybe it evens out.
yeah, I think this is a case where averages are challenging, because if
For
you
sure.
know, right, that maybe 2% of the students cheat completely, and so is that a concern for you or not? Maybe it is, maybe it isn't.
Michael, do you know, has ETS looked into summative assessment, formative assessment as a predictor over summative assessment?
I'm familiar with a few studies like that, and some of the challenge that we face is the fidelity at which the formative assessment is administered, and also the variations in what we think of as formative assessment. So, people have looked at portfolios, for example, and the comparison of performance. So one of the interesting, and I think, correlation is important, but one of the things that we have to do is to go beyond correlation in these studies. So one famous example of correlation is that if you look at test scores of physics majors and English majors on literacy related assessments, there's a relationship between being a physics major and a high score. Now, what does that tell you about the assessment? That there's something about the nature of our conventional assessments that seems to favor physics majors over, say, English majors in that type of environment. So some of that we have to capture and control for, and think about also the question about the formative assessment it is very often different from the question that you're facing in a summative assessment, both having value, but different values. And this is what we're hearing from our friends who are the computer scientists in the Rhapsode platform of Area 9. They think that learning is the preeminent dominant feature of the AI. That in fact, if you think about trying to accomplish the same assessment objectives that you would in a summative assessment, maybe we have a longer way to go than we think. That the primary purpose is learning, and that the assessment is there to complement, to add value to the learning process, the teaching and learning process. And if we can measure that in isolation from, whether we're getting the same result on the summative, then that's really important. That's preeminent important. That doesn't remove the curiosity that we face about whether we could actually reduce the amount of summative assessment if we have the AI and the formative assessment underway, because that's precisely what we're trying to accomplish in one of these studies. The problem is that we're using the summative assessment as a test of whether the AI worked. so it's an interesting conundrum, but yeah. So yeah, I think you're right. We do need to think about how we're going to construct these kind of studies in the future.
Just to follow up a little bit on that, since we've done some work in this area in the prediction, originally, Steve Fensale over there,
And Neil probably.
he did a lot of the work, and Neil over there. So originally we were thinking that this embedded formative assessment within the curriculum would replace the summative assessment, and maybe that's still the goal. But I think relative to what Michael was saying earlier, a different way to think about it is it establishes kind of a Bayesian prior for the summative, right? And I think, Craig, you also said, like, there is this kind of sense that preparation for the summative might, that kind of mental set of saying, like, I can't just forget something because at the end of the course I'm going to need to take a test, might have some effect as well, or some, positive impact. So anyway, one way to think about it is, instead of one or the other, what the formative assessment is able to do is reduce the number of questions that you can ask on the summative assessment, because you already have a whole bunch of information about what the student knows leading up to that summative.
Yeah, I definitely think that the term Bayesian prior is exactly right. That I think that's a useful way of thinking of it. The other thing that I think we think about a lot is aligning the summative with the formative. That in sort of like, for example, if we're doing frequent testing, maybe the homework for the past 2 weeks have been this collection of problems, and all we're going to ask you on the summative assessment is to redo one of the things that you have already done. And in that light, it emphasizes, this thing that we're giving, we actually want you to learn this stuff. And it's not like we're going to try to trick you or anything like that. We're just trying to get you to take the formative assessment seriously. And so having, just enough summative assessment to shape that behavior so that students are doing the things we think they should be doing.
There's a whole interesting discussion about how you frame what these assessments are and what they're doing that might give us new opportunities to explain to students why we're doing formative assessments and summative assessments that might help.
Susan.
Yeah.
Thank you. I was going to ask what you thought the role of assessment was for the students. If you've got grades for the class, there will always be students that are getting weaker grades. And how, if it's assessment for learning, it's not an assessment that demoralizes them and then stops them undertaking sort of further learning because they assume they're going to do badly on the next test anyway. So yeah, if you're scaling it, if you've got marks A to E, and the student's got a D, and they find that out part of the way through.
Oh, you're saying on the exam?
On the exam, so they've done a summative assessment, they've done badly on it. What are the support mechanisms that should be in place to ensure that they are achieving the best they can? It may be the best they can is a C. How you keep them going, that you don't get the dropouts at that point.
So I don't know if I'll answer. To me, giving them multiple attempts at the same assessment. So we see that students will, in classes that offer second chance testing, which is what we call it when we give exactly 2 opportunities, students will utilize course resources more in that period between the 2 exams than any other time during the semester. So, they take an assessment, they have a very clear understanding of what score they got and specifically which kinds of questions they were missing. They go seek out help at that point because they know they have an opportunity to master the material and demonstrate that mastery. So we find that hugely motivating. I don't know. So that's my quick answer, but
Do you then get penalized for grade inflation? Because that's
so we're
that's the flip to
yeah,
it. They all do better, and then we get told, well, actually, you still got to put a Gaussian curve
no.
to it.
So I'm a huge fan of criterion reference grading. So no. For so many reasons. That yeah. So we do put some weight, and this is a little surprising for a lot of people, on that first exam. So your score is some combination of the 2 scores. So for us, maybe like 10% on the lower and 90% on the higher. We, again, going back to sort of behavioral economics, that if there's no weight on that first exam, they don't take it nearly as seriously as they would if there's even epsilon weight. I don't know if there's comments from.
Yeah, so this is an interesting problem. I've even been in teaching situations where we were rationing grades so that to avoid grade inflation, we were allowed to give so many A's, B's, and C's, and so on. Which is interesting, and that was at the university level at a highly selective university. So this is an interesting continuing problem. One of the things that I recently heard a talk by Gloria Latson Billings, who talked about the context of performance, and what one of the challenges for the AI technology in teaching, learning, and assessment is to produce opportunities that are different for people to learn and to perform, so that they're not necessarily doing the same task to demonstrate what they know and can do. And the other is to establish a system where you can be correct and get the minimum passing level, or you can go to as far as you can to advanced levels of proficiency and performance. This is an interesting problem in the context of things like the Common Core state standards in the U.S. K through 12 system, where you can meet the standards with a certain threshold of performance. But what you want to do is to be able to challenge people to go as far as they can go, and then to be able to recognize and reward, along a continuum at above passing, at above proficient. And this is a perpetual problem, whether it's in advanced placement exams or any other type. So this is an interesting challenge.
So I wanted to shift a little. So far, at least my implicit understanding is we're talking about assessment in the cognitive domain. Temple got me thinking earlier, which is about younger children, it's engineering, ABET,
Is that better? Okay. I was moving beyond cognitive to socio-emotional domain teamwork. I think OECD was working with ETS a few years ago on how, how to assess teamwork because it's not something you can just assess an individual person on. And so I got really interested in this in the context of this particular group, the computing power, teamwork assessments with a virtual teammate. What are some of the, on the horizon approaches where we can assess many of the things we deeply value and we know that are essential for success in conjunction with the cognitive skills?
Yeah, so I think yeah, one of the areas of greatest challenge has been assessing creativity and allowing creativity to represent some standards or domains of knowledge and skill. And this is bubbling up in PISA, but ETS is not doing PISA at the moment. But the two people at ETS who I've been involved with who are conducting work on what we are calling collaborative problem solving or collaborative performance on task are Jessica Andrews and Junggang Hao. And the technology for doing this is becoming very interesting. We are trying to use the Rhapsode platform at Area 9 to do some of this. So then you run into the conventional kind of questions. And let me just inject the algebra project work where the performance is experiential performance and learning is another area that we're taking a look at this. So the questions are, how do you assign and distribute the performance across a group when there's unequal participation or contribution? And now, if that remains an important criterion, then we've got an interesting situation. Now, if you're awarding performance on the basis of the collection and the aggregation of the group, that's very different. So I think what the technology permits us to do, though, is to elicit and to coax and to try to pull out the participation as long as you've got time, because it gives you more time. It gives you more opportunities for individuals within the group to evaluate each other. Those are some of the strategies that I've been observing lately.
I'm not sure if a lot, but meaning that I hope our answers are compelling. But some of the things that we've been looking at that span both of those is looking at identity within the disciplinary space, right? So for instance, if I am an 8-year-old, do I believe I could be a mathematician? Do I believe that I can do math? What is told me on the outside within my ecosystem that I can or cannot do math? So can we create short assessments that look at the growth of math identity, right? Or my identity as a reader. Because a lot of times when we are sitting, as an educator, sitting with somebody, if they can't believe that they can read, then they are going to approach the assessment in a completely different way than if, as an educator, I am looking at the ways in which the way I teach, right, or what I teach also is bringing along some of those more social or emotional areas, along with understanding within discipline what I need to know. So for us, we're really deeply looking at the role of disciplinary identity, disciplinary belonging. We're creating new measures that may span 2 or more levers for us. And so the role of executive function, maybe, and emotional development. So the ways in which we look at even self-regulation differently, right? So that's kind of some of the work that we're starting. I think for us, because we're so new, we have a lot of more work to do. We're about 8 months in to our work, but we've got some amazing teams around the nation that are trying to crack that for us.
Yeah, I don't have a lot to offer on that area of expertise. One I guess two things come to mind. One is, yeah, that automation of some of the cognitive stuff allows us to free up the humans to do these harder, things that we have less experience with. But that said, I think there's, I imagine in the next 10 years, it's not that unthinkable with, the language models like GPT-3 and, GitHub code generation stuff to imagine, like in a lower level computer science class, you could have a simulation where a student, they're a student team with 3, virtual partners is given a piece of work and they have to negotiate how to decompose the work. The virtual partners produce their parts, and that like that's a thing that I can imagine happening in the next 10 years that we could use both to help students develop some of those skills as well as potentially assess them in addition to actual, teams in their classes.
Question first. There is a question on Zoom. You.
Hi, this is Rebecca Keller. I am from Infinite Campus, and I used to be a K-12 teacher. And so when you're talking about formative assessments, I used to do that all the time, and how they merge into summative assessments. I had a hard time splitting the two. But what I really am concerned about is there are so many, well, there's a project actually that I know about that wants to use standardized tests to decide if a student should go to a more advanced course or should do a more advanced project. And it's done on the college level too with ACTs and SATs. So how do you plan to address that problem of using these standardized tests to determine where a student ends up?
Well, I'll take a stab at one way that we are having to think through that is to try to understand what the University of California system has decided to do, and it's not the only place, but it is a prominent place that's gotten our attention. There are 13 criteria that they're using for admission, none of which is a test, a standardized test. They're not asking for it and they're not reviewing it. So it's beyond test optional. And when I look at the criteria, they're looking for students to describe themselves. They're looking for students to write about their context, their own journey, their own learning journey, and what they think they've learned, how they've learned it, and what they're going to be interested in learning going forward and how they want to know it. Those are really interesting, and it's very new. So, this is just one example of what you're describing, I think, which is, which will be a natural experiment because of the change in the policy.
Thank you. That was, I have another question, and it has to do with, I'm not sure if I could formulate it very well, but when I think about kids, they just don't necessarily show what they know as well as we would like them to. And I'm just trying to figure out so for a course recommender, how can we incorporate other things into a course recommender to make sure kids really can go wherever they want to go?
Yeah, Temple may, and Craig may.
I was in my head saying, not it. The reason being is the question is so important, but I don't know, right? I mean, there's so much that goes in decision making, and because we work with young ones, I looking at the secondary space or post-secondary space is tough for me. So it's not my area of expertise. I do agree that it's important, right? That, and so I lean back into my role as a special educator. We had multiple ways, multiple methods or information that we use to make decisions. And so I guess my best stab at that would be to look at what else do we need to be considering when we're making those decisions? But unfortunately, I think my expertise is maybe a little bit outside the bounds.
Yeah, it just feels like it goes back to the conversation we were having earlier about, using formative and, maybe in conjunction or leaning heavily. That's a case where I think the consequence of putting a kid in a class that they can't handle, like if they cheated to get into the class that they can't handle, I'm less concerned about that. So I think, if we do have access to, the students' performance on formative assessments, that's a great place to use that kind of information.
I recently had the opportunity to participate in in the audience of a presentation by a high school teacher and about half a dozen, maybe 7 or 8 students who were part of a robotics international competition that they participate in every year. And they compete with peers across, throughout the world. And ultimately there are winners of first place, second, third, and so on. And everybody gets a ranking and a position in the ranking, and it's a pretty large competition. And what it causes them to do is to think about the multiple aspects of the problems that they're going to solve. And some of them are computer related problems of establishing, the physical robot. Some of them are, and its functioning. And some of them have to do with management of the enterprise, of the project itself. So, using much more accounting and so on. So developing teams of people with different expertise to solve problems may be one way. So your question made me think of the prospects that project-based learning, which I would think of that as, offers us for getting variety in both what people work on, how they work on it, and what they produce, and how they build teams to produce it. So, it's an interesting question.
Thank you.
Hey, on one end of the spectrum, we have like very structured assessments, like multiple choice questions, and then we have very unstructured assessments, like maybe drawing a picture. Craig mentioned some interesting like semi-structured assessments, like working with a 3D model. I was wondering if you had any other interesting like semi-structured assessments that you would recommend us to consider as educators.
Feel free to, if you have good examples.
Well, jumbles, which in computer science, somehow Parsons gets credit for jumbles, which is a really old idea, but
Right.
Parsons problems, if you know those, right? But that in Duolingo, there are jumbles, right, where you translate this sentence from English to Russian. Here are 8 Russian words to put in order to make a 5-word sentence, that sort of thing. I think those are nice. They have a feeling of open-ended. They're easy to do automated assessment. There's a lot of options.
Yeah.
Menu-based self-explanation, where here's the solution, but can you explain why, right? And doing that open-ended or menu-based, that can be super powerful both.
I think completion tasks where, I'm giving you partly completed work that you can then finish. So, for example, we've given them a working processor implementation in Verilog and say, implement a new instruction in this thing. So, so you have to understand the code base that you're given, plus, do a small modification to it. I don't know if.
We actually, it's time I think for us to end, and Temple has to catch a plane. So there's a cab waiting out
Fingers and
for her.
toes crossed.
So,
gotta get there.
Yep.
give